Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to our study of Contemplating Reality by Andy Karr, and this is our third session. Could someone just confirm that the sound is all right? Someone could type in that it's okay. We occasionally experience sound issues. Thank you. Good. And also, just before, there were some strange things happening with the software here, so I hope it's not going to affect the webinar, but it's something I've never encountered. So there was just some irregularities, but I hope we'll be okay. Okay. So, beginning with paying homage then to the lineage masters, Jakob Jamgon Control, and Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso. I pay homage to the ocean of Dharma. I pay homage to the ocean of ethics. I pay homage to the ocean of qualities and the oceans of compassionate ones who open the Dharma gate. So just to sum up, we've understood that the issue that we are addressing here, the issue of the rope that's misperceived as snake, this is what the Buddhist path is about. So we're not about trying to go into a particular spiritual realm, really. We're just trying to see clearer. And so we've discussed the various approaches we have in Buddhism, or at least a few of them. Overall, we say themes that run throughout the many different teachings we find in Buddhism, the 3 turnings and the 4 tenets. And then Andy Karr presented, which is really an important point, the way of contemplation. And that is such an important point, really, because we, particularly us in the modern world, we receive teachings that, of course, have been developed outside of our culture, and we more than anyone need to actually make sense of it in a general logical sense, but also on a very personal level. Then chapter 4 was about what we mean with selflessness and the fact that our mistake is what really drives all the suffering there is. There is no self, and yet we conceive of it. And so to get to begin the path of seeing through this, exposing the hoax, we have the Vibhashika analytical approach, looking at things in the minute components of reality, and then the Sautrantika that has a more epistemic approach of valid cognition, seeing what can we actually trust in terms of what we're seeing. Are we actually really seeing the object, or are we just looking at our projection? And then we had a very nice poetic interlude, which really drives home the nature of the simplicity, and particularly, obviously, haikus. They're excellent in just reflecting the atmosphere of the simplicity. And overall, so much of the Dharma art is a natural expression of the Dharma. Trungpa Rinpoche himself was a great artist, and many teachers, Khenpo Rinpoche, the late Khenpo Rinpoche, many are, Songsa Gyamang Khenpo Rinpoche, naturally, out of Dharma, out of the seeing reality, then comes a natural expression of beauty, which is a way of interacting and compassionately engaging with the world around us. So presently we are then going to be looking at the Mahayana, and the Mahayana is big in the sense that this is complete openness. We're no longer holding on to the assumptions that are basic even to the Vibhashika and the Sautrantika, that there is some solid reality out there. We're heading into a much wider, vast openness which doesn't objectify anything whatsoever. This also means that enlightenment is no longer seen as a place of peace that we retreat into, and so naturally, as an expression of that kind of selflessness that doesn't retreat into itself, the Mahayana Buddhist is dedicated to all life, all sentient beings. And Karr says, all Mahayana schools show that there is no world outside that exists the way we conceive it to be. Outer and inner worlds are projections. On the other hand, no school denies that there are appearances, but appearances are no longer taken to be the appearances of real objects. They are empty. The appearances are empty of any true existence. Relatively they appear, but ultimately they have no nature. So the analysis that we saw previously is really essential, but now we take it a bit further. Naturally, our belief in materiality is very deep-rooted. This belief is refuted through analysis. We speak of something called nothing withstands absolute analysis. Now, emptiness is not a belief. It's something that we see. Either we see it directly or we can infer it. Ego might not be comfortable with such a view in practice. Modern culture is new to the idea of emptiness as a lack of inherent existence. So in the Buddhist method, then we speak of analysis. And this is intended to expose our confused assumptions, like we look at the snake. And so with regards to our assumption that there really is things solidly out there, we're not coming up with some thesis or hypothesis or theory or something that is a metaphysical belief or because somebody said so or the book says so. We're just looking. And so we use this method that we call absolute analysis, which is to go right down and completely analyze things, not just stop halfway. And we would say the Vibhashika, they stop halfway in that they don't actually go down to what we call the basis of imputation. So we impute reality on the basis of certain aspects of matter, the subtle particle, and also notions of time. But if we apply the same analysis to these, what we call bases of imputation, or the foundations for this assumption that there is a reality, a real phenomenon, and so on, then that itself also dissolves. So we would say that there is no phenomena that withstands this absolute analysis. So the point is really that we are arriving at the understanding of emptiness as something that is seen. Of course, we might not see it, obviously we can't. It seems very real. But at the same time, it's also something that we see when we understand relativity, that we see things differently. We're going to go into, for example, the analysis of the US president, that we can see our perception is based on our particular relative angle. And so we can inferentially understand that. Also impermanence, that's also something that we might not be able to see directly, but we can still infer it. We still understand, yes, things are impermanent. The content of the fridge will diminish. Our car will have to be replaced. Our shoes, our clothes will have to be replaced. And we obviously also know that we are only here for a very short time. So this lack of ground is contrary to the ego, which would like to continually perpetuate this notion of something that's solid, grounded, and real. So in that way, the Buddhist path as such is not particularly attuned to or aligned with the agenda of ego. But nevertheless, in that we diagnose ego being the cause of suffering, then we might want to get to the bottom of this. And we can also see the egoless condition is not all that undesirable. If we look at sages, they seem to be enjoying themselves. So we have every reason to be convinced of the value of pursuing this. And again, the ideas that we're presenting here, for example, the complete lack of inherent existence, is not something that is common to some of the ideas in our the sciences, the philosophy, the general trending notions, and so on. In our culture, it's a new dimension, as is, of course, the entire notion of enlightenment. So in that sense, we don't have the support. We're not going to be congratulated for pursuing our study of the Dharma necessarily the way you would have been if you were living in a Buddhist culture. So we can speak of two types of egolessness, and there's a difference in the way that what we call Hinayana provides the individual liberation, and the Mahayana, which then goes further, which is to uproot all delusion. The individual liberation is based on no longer being caught by our perceptions that construct certain realities. We can see, oh, that reality is actually groundless. It's just, partless particles or moments of time that create this, and hence we can have peace. We're no longer caught to the same extent by the afflicted mind and the projections to the same extent. So there is what we call then the experience of nirvana in a smaller sense. From a Mahayana point of view, however, we just refer to it as nirodha, or cessation. Things have been stopped. So that's not seen as absolute liberation. At the same time, there is a sense that that's completely legit, and it's compared to if you're crossing an ocean, that it's all right to stop at an island on the way. The Mahayana, however, is intended to uproot all delusion, and so there they point to how both the subjective experience of our mind, the cognizing sense of our mind, what we normally impute as our identity or self, me, mine, and so on, and the perceived outer world, all the phenomena. The Mahayana points, and not only points to, but analyzes phenomena, exposing then the lack of inherence in self in both the person and in phenomena. And so that's what we call the two types of egolessness. The skillful means aspect of the Mahayana is the natural expression of this selflessness, selflessness is not just a bland state where all of a sudden there's nothing. It's more that we're no longer limited by the fear in terms of living with a self that's separate from the perceived. And so free from fear and free from the insecurity of self, then the natural manifestation of the insight is compassion. And so compassion is something that connects us with something that is selfless. So on the Mahayana, we have the skillful means of cultivating loving kindness and compassion in terms of our ordinary dualistic relative reality, and it is also something that connects us to the absolute, in the sense that this absence of self is the reality of the absolute condition. But the skillful means lie in that we are situated in a world where we do think of self and other. And so us practicing cultivating loving kindness and compassion does miracles in terms of skillfully engaging our existing perceptions of the world as the others, and also it creates tremendous joy on the way. We're far better off being loving, kind people than persons that are retreating into a comfort zone of our self-centering. And Karr says, to put it very simply, selflessness of the individual is realized when we see that the skandhas are not a self. However, we still need stable certainty that the skandhas themselves are illusory. So initially on the level of the Vibhashika and also the Sutrantika, we understand that there is the skandhas don't exist as real as we make them out to. But here we go a bit further, so we see that the self that's imputed on the basis of the skandha is non-existent. But here we go a bit further and look at the skandhas themselves, the form and all the aspects of our mind. We also see these as not possessing inherent existence. So we would say then that is seeing the lack of inherent existence or true existence in things. But of course, we relatively do impute or do experience a true existence of things, and so we might have to start with that. So the Vibhashaka and Sutrantika approach is organic. It's not just that we say, oh yeah, there's those over there, they're doing, their Sutrantika and Vibhashaka thing. It's something we need to begin with, and we do operate it, but then we look at it and we can see how that analysis and that approach eliminates the imputed sense of self. But they are proponents of truly existent things in that they still believe there is a basis in terms of time and subtle matter. They are substantialists or proponents of truly existent thing. In Tibetan, Ngubumawa. So Karr says, Vibhashikas and Sutrantikas understand that apparent reality, particularly the self, is fabricated by the mind. Vibhashikas say that coarse objects and durations of consciousness only seem to exist, that is, they're just concepts. Sutrantikas explain that what only seems to exist are generally characterized phenomena, meaning our projections, the abstract images that appear to our thoughts. So when we come across Mahayana debate, we very often speak about the need for going beyond in the sort of proposition of inherent existence. The Mahayana point out that the substantialist analysis is incomplete. The basis of imputations equally lack true existence. That applies equally to matter and to moments of consciousness. And Karr says, partless particles are just mental constructs, and irreducible moments of consciousness are also just mental constructs. So the Mahayana, they say that the substantialist analysis doesn't go deep enough. And the Mahayanas then identify how if we apply this analysis of going in and seeing where are the constructs that form the impression of something solid, this also will reveal a lack of true existence. So for example, with subtle particles, they also are seen to have parts. So then again, these parts in themselves also can be taken apart. There's a standard Buddhist argument that is, if particles didn't have any parts, then when we have particles coming together, then there would be no difference. Then they would all be part of one, and they would never be partless. That's the absurd consequence of stating the idea of partlessness. So we would basically say that any subtle particle again has parts. So the idea of some ultimate partless indivisible particle is just impossible. And the same then also if we can apply the same analysis also to time. Present time is again many micro moments, and each of these aren't absolute. As far as past tense goes, yes, it's very much a relative understanding, but it doesn't have any actual reality. Past is gone, future is not there. So we assert that both with regards to the phenomenal world externally and also time, these are constructs, dependent arising. Now, this I'd like to highlight Andy Karr's value, the value of this work, and also really celebrate somebody doing this, because this is really essential for us who approach Buddhism in the modern world. So we talk about Western science, but it is not just Western science. It's really modern science. It's not at all sort of just based in the US and Europe. It is something that's basic to the entire world, but it is a view that all of us were brought up on. And like he says himself, in his time, then there's been so many shifting ideas of physics from the standard model of physics, where you operate with the idea of atoms and so on, up to the present day quantum mechanics and string theory, where Andy Karr says, from a Mahayana perspective, it's safe to say that Western science will never get to the bottom of this. It will never discover fundamental building blocks, because the very notion of fundamental building blocks is based on the belief that phenomena truly exist, and therefore some basic unit of phenomena must exist. And this, of course, is something this haunts Western science or modern science in itself, within the scientific community. So this is something that you'd be cautious bringing this up, because it's very sensitive, but at the same time it is really the big problem, and how to understand in this. And so from the Buddhist point of view, then we're pursuing something that is very, very complex. So we have, of course, the present idea of string theory, and at the same time also there's a lot of confusion within the community of those that pursue string theory, and there is actually no unanimous, clear idea where this is going. So the idea of this continual fundamental building blocks, then, that science, so we have this situation, like Andy Karr says, rather than finding fundamental building blocks, science will continue to find subtler particles, which of course is what we have, and then all the way down. And as far as all the way down goes, okay, I'll just, because it's so delightful, I'll read that little sweet story. So this is from, I think it's Stephen Hawkins that refers to the story. A well-known scientist, and some say it was Bertrand Russell, once gave a public lecture on astronomy. He described how the Earth orbits around the Sun, and how the Sun in turn orbits around the center of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, "What you have told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant tortoise." The science gave a superior smile before replying, "What is the tortoise standing on?" "You're very clever, young man, very clever," said the old lady, "but it's turtles all the way down." and I'm thinking maybe this old woman was a manifestation of Manjushri, because she is actually pointing out this problem, the absurd problem with the idea of ever smaller relative constructs. And also here we haven't actually gone into the idea of the objectivist model, which is challenged by quantum mechanics, which does identify how the appearance of the object is contingent of the perceiving subject. So anyway, it's complex, but these are issues actually that we would need to take into account, because they're part of our cultural heritage. So if we're going to assert emptiness, we actually can't just have this compartmentalized. That's our Buddhist belief in emptiness. But emptiness, to work for what it is, to actually liberate the mind from the confused projection of solidity, both with regards to self and perceived object, then we need to actually go through this exercise. So this is really then here, the contemplating reality lies. So the problem with scientific realism is that it's so widely accepted. It has such popular traction, and we all grew up with the idea of there's all these little atoms like billiard balls, right, that are reacting and so forth. But it actually has very little to do with reality. And so we do have this this idea of a reality that's built by these building blocks. That's something that's very common to the to the common belief. And it's still, I don't know where I was being taught when I was a kid in physics. I don't know if it's still being taught, but the thing is, when I was a kid in physics, quantum mechanics had already been around for more than a generation, and still, there was very little said about that. So also when we operate with this, then we explain the dynamics of phenomena through mathematics. And then we end up with reductionism. We have formula. And these are very practical ways of understanding how things interact. So thanks to the mathematics and what we call then reductionism, or sometimes mechanistic reductionism, we can actually understand how things interact. And it gives us a great way of calculating the laws of how physical matter behaves. And it also gives us an idea of the nature of reality. So we end up thinking that this is how it actually is. The idea of the model of atoms and the mathematics and so on, all the laws and so forth, we actually no longer are in touch with the object itself. We're more operating with the formulas. So this is a bit like where the project of, say, physics, it becomes more about understanding, like Andy says, knowing the bus schedule than actually being familiar with the bus. So, and similarly also then Andy points out how the string theory is very often sort of presented as the new grand unified theory. And yet after actually quite a few decades of a lot of funding and attention has gone into it, still no conclusive insights have emerged. The basic problem that we are, sorry, I think that it's supposed to say the mind-body problem up in the top. This is a leftover from last week's heading. So it should say the mind-body problem. It's that heading in the Mahayana chapter. So dualism. Are our perceptions mind or matter? And that's what we have in the Cartesian dualism, the idea of our perceptions that we have. On one hand, there is matter on one hand, on the other hand, there is mind. So materialism or physicalism are all perceptions matter. And David Chalmers then famously has spoken about the hard problem of experience, also known as the hard problem of science. And it's the issue of consciousness. What is it? So in Western philosophy, famously, we have René Descartes, who comes up with the notion that there's a soul on one hand and then there's matter on the other. And he says, well, we let the church take care of the soul, and then we scientists, we're free to operate with phenomena out there as matter. And that's Cartesian dualism, and it freed up basically science to do whatever they liked. And also then what we have from that point onwards is with that the church is sort of just not part of science anymore, and just operating on a very limited scale of just the mechanistic material dimensions. Then of course science made tremendous progress, and so we end up in the modern day where we have what's called materialism, where actually the idea of soul is completely discarded. At one point then, applying scientific method, or rather the scientists, the physicalists, they would say to the church, well, prove the existence of God, prove it, as if it was something that could be known objectively. And in this way, also the church wasn't terribly good at argumenting for their position, which was entirely on the level of the intangible. And as a result, anyway, we end up presently with the what we can call materialist monism. There's no longer dualism; it is monism, that we just say, think there's all there is really is the physical. And so this is the place then that nowadays that in that materialist science doesn't find anything tangible. As far as consciousness goes, there are scientists which would say, well, there is nothing except just matter. And any mental experience that we have is just understood in terms of neural correlates, which is then the brain activity that signifies or signals that there's mental activity. So, like Andy says, the problem with this view is that it does not begin to explain how purely material substances can give rise to subjective experience. There we are having a personal experience, and what does that have to do with the material? And also there is, also in terms of just the genesis of consciousness, and this is also the point the Dalai Lama makes, how can something that doesn't possess consciousness create consciousness? So this is also something that in some way it's not a fair game, because it is something that it's a weak point again within modern science, and it is, like David Chalmers says, the hard problem of experience. So this is where David Chalmers says we have the soft problems, which is understanding the dynamics of, say, neurocorrelates and how experience is pursued in terms of how we function and so on, measuring then the brain and so forth. But as far as understanding what consciousness really is and what experience really is, then there actually is no satisfying answer to this. And in terms of our present project, then Andy gives a reason why we really should look into this. He says, since subjective experience is the most intimate aspect of our entire existence, it is hard to take seriously any solution to the mind-body problem that ignores it, meaning experience. And this, of course, is what we are looking at here. So, guys, you're very welcome to ask questions. There are no questions right now, so I'll keep going, but you're very welcome. Also, there was a few people who have sent me questions. I have tried to answer them in mail. One of them actually I will be answering in the context of the text here. So, but please feel free to email me or to type in questions presently. Yeah. Gosh. I'm sorry. Anyway, so what we have with the present day situation really is the modern. I think I've made a mistake here. Yeah, again, sorry, it's not only that. Sorry. Oh, well. Actually, here I intended to write matter. So this is, of course, what we have, and this is also where we have the where the Dalai Lama goes and speaks with some physicists, and they're just explaining how the various experiences that people have can be seen in terms of chemical reactions in the brain. So that's how experience arises. And the Dalai Lama says, well, could it possibly be seen the other way around? That possibly it's experience that then results in these external manifestations of physical matter. And he's then quite bluntly told that here then we operate uniquely with the notion that there is only the physical. And so that is a very limiting commitment in terms of understanding experience. Of course, it has nothing to do with what we feel, but it is, of course, something that you're obliged to do when you operate within the context of reductionism. to just see things in terms of matter that can be objectified and externally manipulated and so on. And that's how everything is seen to operate. And the Dalai Lama says then, it's a bit like, and yet not having satisfactory answers to understanding what consciousness is, then it is a bit like if somebody, they say, okay, I know this thing that I've lost is in the room, and then I'm going to find it, and then we keep looking and looking, and then not finding it, and somebody says, well, maybe it's outside of the room, and the person says, no, it is in the room. so it is a bit a limiting commitment. And the Dalai Lama comments. And the Dalai Lama is really very much engaged in a dialogue with modern science. And of course, some of you might know the Mind Life Institute, which has been going probably around 30 years now, with annual symposia. They are then events where the greatest neuroscientists actually meet and talk with the Dalai Lama. They're all a bit tickled to come together with the Dalai Lama, and he really does hold the space with tremendous lack of bias, where then there's dialogue between learned Tibetan scholars and what we could call mind scientists, but basically geshes and khenpos, and then these neuroscientists. So the Dalai Lama is very much in the thick of this dialogue, and he's very much a hub for all of this. It's a tremendous blessing, really. It's a tremendous fortune we have that. He comments, I think that in modern Western society there seems to be a powerful cultural conditioning that is based on science. But in some instances, the basic premises and parameters set up by Western science can limit your ability to deal with certain realities. And of course, we are talking about the realities of emotions. We're talking about the causes of happiness, and ultimately then also understanding what consciousness is. And implicitly, if we were to step outside of the presumption of the primacy of matter and then step into embracing the idea that possibly consciousness could be primary, which is what we're doing here, then it's through consciousness that we'll understand reality. So in that sense, this is no trivial matter. Anyway, His Holiness also does it with tremendous joy and ease, and that also is it's a really big teaching, actually, to not get ensconced in fundamentalist rigid positionings in this dialogue, and just maintain dialogue and conversation and so forth. So when we have the two positions that we inherit then from the Western scientific camp, which is dualism and materialism, they both assert an external world. And as we can see here, we can find nothing when we analyze. Now, Buddhism asserts appearances as mind, and Chittamatra asserts that mind then as absolute. The Madhyamika, on the other hand, they assert that mind also in itself, like anything, is a dependent arising. So we'll look at that. Now, yeah, and as far as this thing with the primacy of mind go, yes, some will of course say, well, we have idealism. We have the likes of Bishop George Berkeley, who assert that everything is mind. And there are people, I think also even Bertrand Russell actually was identified as an idealist. But then again, it's a little bit tricky to begin to say, oh, they are the same. I know Andy does it here, and he says that the Chittamatra corresponds to idealism, and it definitely corresponds. But of course, also they each have their own very particular views and methods. Anyway, we'll look more about the Chittamatra then in the 9th chapter, and then the middle way, the Madhyamika, in the 10th chapter. Now, so it's not as if Mahayanists are against science, like Gandhi says, au contraire. And we are, of course, all very committed to and comfortable with the creations of modern science. Yeah, it enables us to have all this stuff. And so in one way we can say science enables us to operate with a great insight, a practical efficacy when it comes to dealing with the natural world through this ability to calculate through this reductionist approach. So we're not at all demonizing this. Tibetan lamas are the first to be very happy with modern medicine and modern phenomena. But we're also wanting to identify the limitations, and that's when it comes down to really understanding reality, both reality as we understood as the external world and also the reality of our own happiness and the possibility of enlightenment and so forth. So we're not absolutely impressed with the science that we have handed down to us in the modern world. At the same time, also, yes, it does provide for all sorts of comforts that we become, very habituated to. So we shouldn't think that Mahayanists are against science. And also in general, there's one thing, and that's very Madhyamika, and you could say Buddhist in general, that is that we accept the phenomenal world. And particularly when it comes to the Madhyamika, there's a quote that always comes back where the Buddha says, whatever the people of the world say, I agree with them. Because people will see things from their own particular angle, you can't deny, two people looking at one person and one person saying, that's my wife, and the other says, this is my employee. They're saying two different things, but at the same time, and they're both true. So you can't say they're both saying conflicting things, but of course what they're also saying is relatively true. So in that way, there's not a dismissal of the phenomenal world. We conclude this chapter with the prayer from the aspiration from Andy Karr's teacher, the gentleman on the right in the homage at the beginning of the slides, Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso, who says, may the sciences that explore outside be joined with the inner science of the mind to excellently put an end to mistaken views and confusion, and by this auspiciousness light up the whole universe. So it's clear that the science that we are approaching here, the science of mind, operates with similar methodological premises of rationality and analysis and empiricism, inferential logic, and so forth that we find in Western science. So we're not operating with a priori assumptions, metaphysical beliefs, and so on. We're operating with analysis. And so, and also there's a long quote from Ponlop Rinpoche then that speaks in terms of this journey into the inner reality. Just like if we have explorers that travel to faraway unknown territories, if they come back, we listen to what they have to say. And they've had findings there that while we can't perhaps immediately verify them, we also very often say, okay, that's really interesting. This is what they saw, and this will help us to make the same journey. Okay, we have some questions. So, conversations about science can be a good way to bring up questions about reality with non-Buddhists. Can you suggest skillful ways to introduce non-duality and emptiness? Well, non-duality we can understand from our experience that on a very personal level, we very often are affected, or rather due to our moods and so on. Our moods very often influence the way that we see the world around us. I think everybody has and this is, of course, this moves away from science and more is within the realm of phenomenology, shared experience, where we all know that our attitudes have so much to do with what we experience around us. So when we're relaxed, then very often we have a wonderful day, and we'll have interesting, meaningful encounters with others. And then on days where we're uptight, angry, nervous, paranoid, then the world appears like a hostile place. So that's one way we can understand duality. We can also talk about it from the purely ontological view of saying that we cannot assert the true existence of phenomena externally, and at the end of the day, in that there's just particles, all we are looking at are our own projection. But that is a tough one, and I would, as far as non-duality, I would say I would stick to shared experience of how our subjective optics affect the way that we interact with the world. Emptiness is something where we could introduce this in terms of relativity, like the way that that we see things differently and they're equally true. And so that's where we can present the idea of relativity. And again, when we're talking about science, we can also bring in quantum mechanics that speaks about the presence of the observer in the perception of the object, and hence the lack of intrinsic reality in the observed object. People actually understand emptiness intuitively. They also understand non-duality intuitively. So I think while we can sort of stick to uh, hard analytical science, then very often we can also do it just purely from the point of view of the intuitive and the logic. Is part of the reason for, particularly Westerners, being so concerned with the mind is the brain issue a cultural need for an ontological position? That's an interesting question. I think it is. It is actually. I think we can bring it back to the old thing about the struggle with the Greek, marrying the Greek rationality with the irrational um, belief system that we got from the Abrahamic traditions. And that's where there's so much has been the idea of finding a truth out there. So not being able to marry the two, basically not lacking this sort of the idea of the two truths and relative and absolute truth and so on. There's a lot of confusion, but we have very much a cultural pursuit of this need for an ontological absolute. So yes, I think you're right. It's an interesting thought, actually. It seems that in the West we are so used to being given the answers to life. Yes, science and theistic religions tend to do that quite well. Well, exactly. And we so much want them to be things that we can just have as objects. We don't really want to do any work in terms of the idea that we are actually presently obscured. We're a bit delusional and something needs to be done for us to see the truth. It's not that welcome. We'd rather like to have it served up. This is the truth, you know. You might not have it, but then I have it for you. And so everything's taken care of. Yes. Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Chapter 8, Chittamatra. There is only mind. So we're talking about these tenets. So we've covered the Vibhashika, the Sautrantika, and now we're in the Mahayana. The first one we are going to look at is Chittamatra. The other one that follows this will be the Madhyamika. So these are the four: the Vibhashika, Sautrantika, Chittamatra, and Madhyamika. So Andika defines then the Chittamatrans, and they're also known as Yogacharyans. Now, Yogacharya means those who practice yoga, and it is the yoga then of the mind. And we'll look at that, I think, next slide, but that is really where the Chittamatra come from, this need for dealing with the mind. And they also have the notion of settling into the nature of the mind. And so they practice this essentially practice of yoga. So we'll see as we have the Madhyamikans, which are more about just dispelling all notions of any reality. then practically to apply it, of course, the Madhyamikans also need to do some yoga. They need to settle the mind. But that is then the emphasis in the Yogacharyan project, is the role of the mind. So hence, then, they are also known as the Yogacharyan, or the yogic practice or yogic conduct school. So when we say Chittamatra, we can more or less say it's the same as Yogacharyan. Yogacharyans see that all phenomena are nothing other than mind. They see that all conceptions are mind, and all perceptions are also mind. Our worlds are made of mind in the same way that dream worlds are made of mind. Now remember, in the Sutrantika we talked about conceptions and perceptions. So conceptions lie in the subject, and the perceptions are more what we perceive of as the object. So this is all then the mind. So the Yogacharyans are onto something that we probably would have a hard time disagreeing with, is that everything we do really is filtered through the mind. The school as such is associated with a great master called Asanga, who was a great sage, and in his experience, the Asanga had an encounter with the Buddha Maitreya, the Buddha that will come after Shakyamuni Buddha. So in the the cosmology of Buddhism, we talk about the fourth Buddha being Shakyamuni, and the fifth one will be Maitreya. So Maitreya, he's presently he's presently abiding in what's called the Tushita realm, which, of course, from our Western perspective, again, is sort of turning it into something rather theistic and so on. But I think we can just see it in terms of just the unconfused condition that is then accessible to someone who is not confused, in this case then Maitreya. But I do also think we can think about there actually is some communication taking place from an enlightened person to a non-enlightened person. So the language that we have around this is really that after 12 years of practice, then Asanga encountered the Buddha Maitreya. It's a beautiful story, and if we had more time, I'd tell about it. But you can always Google it, Maitreya and Asanga. Anyway, from Asanga, then, we have these teachings that he received from Maitreya, which are known as the 5 treatises or the 5 dharmas of Maitreya. So when it comes to the Yogacharyan view, then we have Jamgon Kongtrul that Andy Karr cites, and he summarizes the Chittamatra view as perceived objects and perceiving subjects. Duality is relative. Consciousness that is empty of duality is genuine. This is the presentation of the mind-only school. So I'm not sure there should be a. I don't think we need the apostrophe there. I don't think there's a. What's it called? It's called a genitive. No, what's it called? Possessive. It's not a. What's the grammatic term? Anyway, I don't think that apostrophe is needed. And the basic point really is that the duality of perceived objects and the perceiving subject, this duality is something relative. So that's why we're stuck. And so consciousness that is empty of duality is the awakened mind. So I make this graph, and I ran this by Tsongsa Khyentse Rinpoche once. I got his approval, and it's basically like a slider. So on one hand, we have the confused state of samsara, and on the other hand, we have nirvana, which becomes the quality of nirvana and awakening becomes more and more clear then as we progress. So this whole square, the whole thing in itself is what we could call then the mind, that the Chittamatrans assert as real. And then and this is also what we'll look at that next time in the 3 natures, but they refer to that as this whole thing as the dependent nature. And so in the condition of samsara, then the confused condition, this is what where we have what's called the imaginary nature, and that's where we have this duality, the perceived object and perceiving subject. That's where we're confused. And as we gradually have less and less duality, then eventually then there is the seeing of the consciousness, the underlying condition of the reality of the mind, which is then free from this duality. That's where we then have the genuine experience. So we'd say consciousness that is empty of this confused condition of duality, that is genuine. So as we arrive at that, then there is awakening. So in terms of the three nature, then we talk about the imaginary nature, which is basically the white here, which is samsara, the confusion. And we talk about the authentic or the perfected nature, which is nirvana, awakening, and that's then that has this which has light, which is, and that is, all of this is then taking place within the dependent nature, which is then the mind. So that's why they're called the mind only. They would assert that there is a mind. As we'll see, the Majamicans, they're going to say, well, even that mind is also a construct. So what we perceive out there, according to the Chittamatra, is our projection. It's constructed by our conceptions, and these conceptions, they are what shape our perceptions. So that's coming again back to the idea of our optics. So of course it seems to us, it's obvious that there are objects out there, and our confusion, our ego, actually very, very much operates with sustaining this duality. There's a stubborn tenacity about ego. So at this point it's essential that we question and we clear up any doubts, what it is that we are speaking about here. While we understand it, we're also not going into immediately assuming that, well, if that's reality, then it wouldn't matter if I'm hit by a car or a rock lands on my head. It's all just figments of the thoughts. That's not at all the issue, because we are relatively very much stuck in terms of this reality. But it's more that we begin to catch on to how this appearance of these perceptions in fact stem from our particular concepts. Yeah? So there was somebody who brought up the idea of the idea of awakening then means that we merge into a greater collective mind. That actually we don't. It might be the conclusion we might get from the idea of one mind, but it's also something that's not really what one mind talks about. It's not where we merge into a collective experience where we know everybody's thoughts and we are all one. It's true that the sage would be much less cut off from the experience of others, and out of compassion and the lack of duality, there will be much more awareness of the other. But at the same time, we don't say that we merge into one. If that were the case, then when one person would become enlightened, then we'd all become enlightened as well. We're very much stuck with our individual mind stream. The Buddha became enlightened, many have become enlightened. We're still not enlightened, so we still have to do the work for ourselves. Emerging, you could say, when no longer being confused, then of course there will be the awareness of the others and knowledge of the others, and we would even speak about omniscience as being a great capacity to understand the others. But at the same time also this is very much within the individual's mind stream. So as far as this as far as what we call samsara goes, then we talk about different realms, right? The hell realms, the god realms, the humans, spirit realms, and so on. And in fact, all of these we could go through just in our own experience in a single day. This is something that's very often talked about. In a single sitting, we might experience going through the sort of the paranoid, aggressive experience of the hells to the self-absorbed bliss of the heavens and everything in between. So we understand that this is something that has to do with our subjective experience. So we also here need to understand that none of this has any reality, and that's also where we look at how our fixations on past and present and future, these are mere projections. We can apply analysis also in terms of deconstructing the reality of that. And we are, however, very prone to be caught up in dream worlds and just lost in this distracted condition. So we have the examples of how we live our life when we are dreaming. And even when we're reading books also, then we're also actually just sitting there dreaming, right? But we're sitting there reading, but we are conjuring up imagery that can be very gripping. Huh? So the Buddha would say that the Buddha quoted then in a text called the Buddha Tamsaka, Buddha Avatamsaka, says the three realms of existence are merely mind. And Jamgon Kongtrul in the Treasury of Knowledge says that which has parts does not exist. Subtle particles also are not existent. Appearances apart from mind cannot be perceived. Experiences are like dreams. Consciousness free from perceiver and perceived exists in genuine actuality. So proclaim those who have gone to the far shore of the ocean of the yogic conduct texts. So this is the teaching of the yogic conduct, that the outer world, as per the Vibhashika and Sutrantika, and also the absolute analysis general to the Mahayana, finds that nothing exists, and also that in fact what we have is an observing mind, a projecting mind. So nothing is more real than a dream. Trungpa Rinpoche, then formulating it slightly different, he says, and this is from Transcending Madness, which is a book on the six Bardos. Trungpa Rinpoche writes, strangely enough, these experiences of the six realms, gods, jealous gods, human beings, animals, hungry ghosts, and hell, are space, different versions of space. It seems intense and solid, but in actual fact, it isn't at all. They are different aspects of space. That's the exciting or interesting part. In fact, it is complete open space, without any colors or any particular solid way of relating. That is why they have been described as six types of consciousness. Here by the way, I don't think we're talking about the six kinds of consciousness as we have in the Abhidharma or the analysis that we had earlier, but we're really just talking about six ways of projecting realms around us. It is, Trungpa Rinpoche continues, it is pure consciousness rather than a solid situation. That is why these levels are referred to as loka, which means realm or world. So, for example, we talk about Lokeshwara, the king of the world, which is this Avalokiteshvara, Chenrezi, who compassionately engages with the world. So, overall, as we're approaching this again and again, we need to make clear that we want to have some personal clarity. This is what we're doing here. So, everything we know through the mind. Perceptions are based on our conceptions, and also then we notice, yes, that we do share perceptions with others. We share similar perceptions with others. So everything that we perceive operates through the mind. And so Kenshin Trangu, he makes then this point with regards to everything that we experience. It's again the mind that comes back to, it's the one who's experiencing and so on. And this is a point that he makes in a commentary on one of Maitreya's famous works, which is then a work called Distinguishing Dharma and Dharmata, or Distinguishing Dharma and Pure Being. So we might think, well, how about these things that are not perceived? Surely they exist. You know, we have the argument against the solipsist view that everything is the mind, where we say, well, what about the tree falling in the forest? But then again, for sure that happens. But our perception, even measuring objectively, if we were to have something out in the woods measuring trees that fall, this would again be something that's constructed by the mind according to our premises. So the animals will hear the falling tree out there in their particular way. Our measuring instrument will, which is made by our minds, and according to our premises and parameters, they'll measure it in our ways. And so we need to come back to really identifying how mind really is key in all perception. So then someone might say, well, look, we all have a reality that seems to be common. But then again, this common reality, the shared world and so forth, is again relative to each and every one of us. We're each looking at a solid reality, but we see it so differently. So we have then shared perceptions with others. Again, then the quote then that Kenshin Trungpa was commenting upon runs: what appear to be outer, perceivable in common, are perceiving awareness. They are not reference, existing as something extrinsic to consciousness, because they are only experienced as common. So we don't, the term reference before, remember when we had the Sutrantika analysis, that there's the idea of something that is the basis for our imputation. This might be perceived commonly by several people, but they don't actually exist as something other than the consciousness. And it's really just the experience that is common. So we have the experience of a place, for example. Three people talking about the same object, they will speak about it very differently. Now, this is illustrated then beautifully by Andy with the notion of the president, the incumbent president during the time of writing that, which was George W. Bush, and of course the incumbent president presently is another chap who needs no introduction. Even the mere mentioning of his name, I think, sets off afflicted states of mind. So let's just leave it as Mr. President. And so this person is then a referent, right? It's an objective referent, but they're seen very different, right? Some perceive him to be dangerous. His children perceive him as a father. His parents perceive him as a son. His political opponents perceive him as an enemy. To a mosquito, the president is a meal. Microorganisms living in his body perceive him as home. Whose version is right? Right? So I think this needs no further elaboration. I think the point is made, but it is really, it's so comical when people sit down and they talk about a piece of music. What is a good piece of music, right? Who's right? What is the good piece of music? Stockhausen? The Clash? Bach? It's so relative to the seer, the perceiver. Jamgun Mipa says, when you see someone as an enemy and they die, you're happy. When you see someone as a friend and they die, you're sad. Happiness and suffering never exist in the entity itself. And so Andy Carr's point here is so much of our suffering comes from believing that our projections really exist the way we perceive them, particularly our projections about other people, what they have or have not done to us. Even a glimmer of understanding that these projections are only mind will make our pain diminish, not to mention the transformative effect recognizing this directly will have. We'll be able to see much clearer. If we have any role in terms of responsibility and caring for others, to be able to step outside of our own projection is essential. And it's, of course, also essential in terms of enlightenment. So we have then we have the Ask Mr. Fly contemplation. So flies, they have these multifaceted eyes which see things in a different way and don't particularly see objects clearly. And apparently they also don't see, what is it, color red. So as far as that goes, then we imagine then seeing cars and houses and people through a fly's eye. And since there is no ideal observer, yeah, like we saw with Mr. President and anything, there is no objective basis for what things look like. We cannot say this is how it is. All appearances depend on the consciousness observing them. So we can then contemplate, do I see this object correctly? Am I seeing it clearly? Then does the fly see it correctly? There comes the fly swatter. It's probably seeing it correctly if it gets away, right? So that's valid cognition. Then again, it might not see it exactly in terms of how we see it. Does the fly see a poorer image of the book because of its inferior visual system? Can we say that the fly has an inferior visual system? Well, we can clearly see it's a very sophisticated visual system. So that seeing it differently, does that make it, can we speak about it, we can talk about it as different, but seeing it as inferior? And then Andy Karr, by the way, very kindly accommodates that we might not like flies, in which we can use this exercise as ask Mrs. Fish. So perceptions arise on the basis of, okay, this is how it is then. Now we're going into this is a bit sort of reductionistic, obviously. We're beginning then to try to understand our experience and how does it arise. Yeah. So we would say the perceptions we have arise on the basis of vasanas, habitual tendencies. And of course, there's a lot to be said about that, but this is really what ends up shaping our perception. And that is what the luggage, the optics that we bring to it. This is then what's imprinted on our being, and it's called vasanas. And vasanas are then these patterns. We have had impulses, we've acted on them, and these have then become patterns in us, vasanas. And they sit on what we call the alaya vijnana, the all-basis consciousness. And that is also the ground of our being, where basically this is where samsara originates. It's from not knowing the ground of the mind that we then misconstrue it as an ego, and there's a basic ground of sense of just unconsciousness, and then comes a sense of me. So that is really where the habitual tendencies, they arise from this ground of confusion. So the alaya vijnana, in its confused state, is the basis for samsara, and when it's no longer obscured, it is in reality the dharmakaya, or enlightenment. So we can say that the alaya vijnana is like the sky at night, and the enlightenment is the sky during the day. And using the three natures from the Yogacarya, we can say the night sky of the alaya vijnana, that's the imaginary nature. The awakened condition of enlightenment is the perfected nature, and this mind that is basic to these two conditions is what we then call the dependent nature. We'll look more at that. But let's hope my explanation is consistent with what Andy explains. I should. Anyway, the Lankavatara Sutra states, the mind stirred by habitual tendencies arise as outer appearances. They are not existent objects, but mind itself. To see external objects is mistaken, and that's the point. And that's where we would want to at least have this sense that what I'm seeing is really my version of what's seeing. There's also an extensive quote then from Jakob, also describing the foundational role in in our perceptions. And Karr says, since there is no truly existent matter, then appearances must be mind. And since appearances are known by the mind, they must be of the same stuff as mind. If they were fundamentally different, how would they ever be known? So what we're looking at right now, we're not looking out and seeing a swarm of what? According to the physicalists, we're supposed to see a field of atoms and neurons. But no, we actually see qualia. We see our perception of things, and we see colors red. If we go in and break down all the particles in there, there's no basis for the color red or white or whatever it might be. So in this way, what we do have is the mind. Ultimately, no duality between perceiver and perceived, and yet in our mistaken perception, there is duality. The sense consciousness has no concept. The commenting mind is not the perceiver. The naked awareness knows, yet needs no words. Okay, let's just get that clear then. Especially if somebody's going to be watching the video. So this is then bringing back the point with regards to analyzing what it is that's basic to our perception, which is then that we perceive, and when we perceive, then there's a commentator. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but we see something, and then there's a thought that comes, that is white, or this is so and so, and that's just the sense conscious. That's just the that's the commenting mind, the language that we use around things. But the perceiver itself, the sense consciousness that takes in this perception, that itself has no concept. So what really links these two together, and that is where we have the quote from Sakya Pandita, is that it's the naked awareness that knows. When we see something, there's just an insight, and that in itself doesn't need any particular word. And that is what then is seen as the for the Yogacaryan point of view, this is the nature of mind. They say that is something that is real. So we have this quote from the Tsema Richter on the Pramana Yukti, the treasury of valid cognition, or Pramana, which states, sense consciousness is a mute who can see. Conceptual consciousness is blind but chatters on. Self-awareness has all faculties complete and makes a connection between the two. So it's as if self-awareness is the sage that makes connection between this one that perceives but cannot say anything about it. My eye sees, and then I have my chattering mind that says, "Oh, that's the white wall," and yes, needs a coat of paint, and so on. So actually, that's the conceptual mind that is blind but chatters on. So I think this is, I think we're kind of up to, the end of our study today. Some questions. Would Patanjali be of the Yogacarya Chittamatra school? Probably. But then again, that he operates within generally the Samkhya school of Indian systems of yoga, and he then operates within some different ideas of what is it again? No, anyway, but yes, they would say that there is some underlying stuff that is the mind. So they would probably find some common ground, the Yogacaryans and Patanjali. And in general, by the way, to be said, because of course within the skillful means of the Vajrayana, there's so much using of the phenomena of the mind, then there is a practice of yoga, and as such, the Indian yogis, the Indian tantrikas, and both Buddhist and Hindu, very much similarities. View different, but very similar in many of the practice aspects. Is the nature empty of duality, as said by Control, the same as dependent nature? Is it empty of duality? If it is empty of duality, how can there be any dependent arising that could be identified? No, the dependent nature is, it's when we in our confusion we attribute solidity and duality to what is dependent arising. It's when we miss emptiness, and so the emptiness or the empty of duality, that's the perfected nature. So we'll look into that more next time. I wonder about his reference to consciousness as Purusha, and if this is something like Buddha nature. Well, that's why there's a little bit of difference because Purusha is then said to give rise to, what is again Prakrit, which is seen as different, and that's where Buddha nature is the non-duality. And I think there's, in the yoga systems, there's some attribution of some duality that takes place. But then again, gosh, obviously we have Vedanta, which is non-dual and so forth. So there's probably some places where there's some common ground. But running through the general atmosphere of Buddhism is very much this asserting the lack of inherent existence, that there's no reference point whatsoever. And that's where sometimes I think in some of the ideas of pure consciousness that we have in the Advaita, there is something that you settle onto. But I'm on, how do you say, shaky grounds. I should be not being brought up with basically Advaita and so on. My sort of contemplation goes more in terms of the Western science, but of course, in terms of us looking at the whole realm of Indian thought into which Buddhism belongs, of course, also we should have some idea of Purusha and Prakrit and so forth. So it is definitely something that we should look into. But there is some subtle difference. Okay, thank you very much. And next time, oh yes, by the way, there's one more last section, which is actually very good on a very practical level. And that is the importance of taking the view to heart. Sorry, I missed that. And in understanding this life is just like one night of dreaming, then knowing the insubstantiality of all things is helpful. So remembering impermanence is helpful. So Padamba said, at first to be fully convinced of impermanence make you take up the Dharma in the middle, it whips up your diligence, and in the end brings you to the radiant Dharmakaya. So we'd want to take this insight and even just have it as a way that we seal our perceptions, just thinking this is like a dream, this is something that won't last, and this will enable us to make meaningful our present existence and also not be attached to it. And the great Jamgamipa Rinpoche says, those who strive on the path of both sutras and the tantras must have a sure confidence in the understanding that all phenomena are but the self-experience or projection of the mind. There is nothing more important than this. And during the night, when one is caught up in one's dreams, if one tries to deal with them using other methods, there is no end. But if one understands that they all arise from the mind itself, all are pacified with a single stroke. We should understand that appearances of existence, which are endless in time and unlimited in extent, are similar to the visions of our dreams. So when we have a dream, it seems so real, and we could, of course, deal with it within the dream. We might be better or worse or whatever. But the thing is, it's all just in a dream, and the real solution lies in waking up. So that's where we would appreciate that our entire reality is similar to these dreams. It's not going to help all our struggle within the dream itself. It's not going to lead anywhere. The only thing that will alleviate the suffering of our conditioned existence is to awaken all together. So, class, for the next time, please read up until page 136. The chapter is Three Natures, and then there's another interlude, which, if I'm not wrong, that's a funny one. And then there's Svatantrikas and Prasangikas, and the great reasonings of the middle way. Yeah. Important to read these. Otherwise, like I said, what I'm doing here is not a digest. It's really just further commentary, assuming you have read it. And the real insight and gain lies in reading the text itself. So, by this positive action may all beings perfect the accumulation of merit and wisdom and attain the two supreme kayas, which arise from merit and wisdom. Thank you.